Good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to see so many of good experts and officials from important institutions. It seems to be that the discussion will be really quality discussion with lots of commentary and questions. For our very distinguished panel, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Simas Chiltka. I'm head of the European Security Program at the Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis. I'll be moderating this discussion, and we also have this evening a very well-known expert on Russia, Edward Lucas. Also Solvita Denisa-Liepniece from the Baltic Centre for Media Excellency based in Riga, and also Anton Barbashin, a managing editor at the Intersection project. So shall we applaud the... And unfortunately, in this discussion, there should have been two more panelists, activists from the independent election watchdog Golos, but unfortunately, one of them, David Kankia, was detained at the Sheremetyevo airport today and detained for 5 days, and it was even reported that he was beaten. And his colleague Vitaliy Averin has also could not come to this event, so it's a very unfortunate turn of events for us. And we symbolically left these two empty chairs to recognize their input into independent election monitoring that is very important for everyone. And I would like to start by quoting some of the information from their report about this election, because it shows that their work is very important and we need to take into account their efforts to really present the objective information about the election in Russia. So on the election day, Golos registered more than 1,500 violations of various sorts. There were ballot boxes that had papers in them before polls officially opened, and video footage of ballot boxes being stuffed. There were also reports that concerned the treatment of observers, including denying them access to polling stations, restricting them from taking photos and videos, limiting their ability to move around premises, and removing them from polling stations. Some Moscow residents were being forced to vote for specific candidates. In one video, an elderly resident from the Sokol district was shown bursting into tears after being pressured to cast her vote by social workers. In other regions, Golos also registered violations. In North Ossetia, for example, at least 2 instances of ballot box stuffing were caught on camera. To sum up, Golos acknowledged the definite strong result of the winning candidate, but regretfully declared that the movement did not recognize these elections as truly fair. It is fully consistent with the Constitution, the laws of the Russian Federation, and international election standards, because the election results were achieved in an unfree, unequal, and uncompetitive election campaign. This fact did not allow Golos, therefore, to assert that the will of the voters was expressed as the result of a free election campaign. So, in this discussion, we will try to grasp the meaning of the outcome of this election and the future of actually many things. One of them is, of course, the fate of the Russian regime. Are we already entering the post-Putin era, as some analysts such as Ivan Krastev, Gleb Pavlovsky, and Brian Whitmore claim, and that the elite groups are already looking to 2024 when Putin might step down or might not step down? Also, the future of the Russia-West relationships, because you know that the recent events show that Russia is even stepping up its aggressive actions, and it poisoned Skripal and his daughter in the UK recently, endangering many other people in Salisbury. So it's interesting to understand whether this aggressive posture is going to remain in place for the next 6 years. And we also need to touch upon the future of the Russian opposition, which also faces, once again actually, faces a big dilemma of how to engage in political activity in Russia, whether to attack the system from the outside or to try to carve some niches inside the system. So we will try to answer all these questions in this discussion, and we will proceed as follows. Our panelists will begin by their introductory remarks, each up to 10 minutes long. Then we will have a discussion in the panel, and finally we will take some questions and commentary from the auditorium. So I would like to begin with Edward Lucas's introductory remarks.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Shima. It's lovely to be back. You can see I was never the technology correspondent. Yes, so I was just saying, for the benefit of people on the live stream who are joining us, it's an honor to be here. And thank you for the invitation. And I think Putin has two basic objectives. One is to make Russia safe for Putin. So that means he doesn't want to end up like Yanukovych, he doesn't want to end up like Gaddafi, he doesn't want to end up like Saddam Hussein, he doesn't want to end up dead or in prison or out of power. And he also wants to make the world safe for Russia, which means a cordon sanitaire around Russia and no international organizations that are able to exert pressure on Russia and constrain it from doing what it wants. Now, in theory, that's quite difficult because his record inside Russia isn't very good. He's not succeeded in modernizing the economy. He hasn't made Russia into a kind of great global geopolitical actor with lots of strong allies and interesting ideas. So the domestic record is pretty patchy. It's very dependent on the oil price. And his record abroad, and Russia abroad, is in a basically difficult environment. And if you just look at the numbers, the population of the West, very broadly defined, including Japan and Turkey, which I'm not sure we can really include anymore, but for the sake of argument we will. The population of the West is roughly 1 billion. The population of Russia is about 142 million. So the West is 7 times bigger in population terms. If you look at GDP, the West is roughly 40 trillion and Russia is about 1.3 trillion. So the West is 14 times bigger than Russia in GDP terms. So in a sense, it's absurd that there should be any difficulty with this. We should be worrying about China or about terrorism, but why worry about Russia? And that was basically the view of the Obama administration, and look where that got us. And I'm afraid that on both those fronts, Putin is doing quite well, and I am a very optimistic person, but I'm alarmed by the wishful thinking which I've been seeing in the West since about 1991, of people first of all insisting that Russia's going in the right direction, then reluctantly admitting that it's going in the wrong direction, but it doesn't matter, then saying it goes in the wrong direction, it does matter, but we can still cope with it. And we've now ended up with a situation where Russia has conducted a chemical weapons attack, a really blatant chemical weapons attack in an English town, killed a British citizen, a Russian citizen, put a policeman with possibly permanent health damage, endangered the lives of dozens of other people, and the reaction of the West is to send a press release. Now, that is really quite a big deal, and that's not because we don't care about it. We care about it very much in Britain, but there's not much we can do on our own. Our economy is dependent on the inflows of foreign money, not least Russian money. There's not a real reluctance to change our business model, and we don't have any allies, really, because relations with the United States are difficult for one reason, and relations with Europe are difficult for another. And I just want to say I was so grateful to Linas who came over last week. We had a dinner for him, and the robust unqualified support that he gave to Britain was really welcome. And I think it really put Lithuania on the map as an important ally. I just wish he hadn't been the only one. I was delighted to see President Grybauskaitė saying that Lithuania is willing to kick out Russian intelligence officers. That's a really big deal for you. If you chuck out 4 people, and they chuck out 4 people, they've just halved your embassy in Moscow. We need other countries to do that. We need the Swedes and the Poles and the Canadians. Even better would be the Americans and the French and the Germans, although don't hold your breath. But Putin can see he's made the world, he's played divide and rule very successfully, and Britain, from being one of the most formidable pillars of the Western alliance, has become, I'm sorry to say, a weak link in the chain. And we see this particularly clearly with the extraordinary business of congratulating Putin on what wasn't really a victory and which wasn't really an election. This was an episode of political theatre in which the script was written from the beginning by the Kremlin, and the only interesting thing for the audience was how the props would be displayed on the stage and which of the characters was going to say their lines in which order. And at the end of this, we have the really grotesque sight of not only the President of the United States, and I'm sorry there are American diplomats in the room, but I'm able to speak frankly, so I will, congratulating a fake president on a fake win in a fake election. But even here in the Baltic states, seeing Baltic unity just falling apart. If there's one thing the Baltic states ought to be able to agree on, it should be, do we congratulate Russia on this election win or not? After all, it's not exactly if it came by surprise, and yet we were unable to get that. And I don't mind if you want to make formal diplomatic, protocol statements, well, that's fine, as long as everybody does it. But this display of disunity, then Juncker making his thing as well, I think Putin must be really laughing at that. So I'm very depressed about that. I feel cross and a little bit scared, actually, that this is going so well for Putin. I think the first thing we've got to do is to drop this wishful thinking. And sorry, Marius is disagreeing with me already. You'll get your chance, Marius. Don't worry. Thank you. Okay. And I've always worried about this idea that there is something good is going to happen very soon. In the 90s, people were saying this can't survive because the Russian infrastructure is going to collapse. And every winter, journalists wrote the same story about how the power grid is machines of the 1930s held together with bits of string and wire, and there's going to be terrible infrastructure collapse. That wasn't a good thing, but people thought it's inevitable, it's going to happen. Then we said the middle class is coming. The Russian middle class will make Russia into a normal country because middle classes are inherently interested in prosperity and freedom. Well, we've seen the growth of something that, at least in economic terms, looks like a middle class. It may have shifted the economic centre of gravity in Russia. It hasn't shifted the political centre of gravity. Then we were told that the youth is going to come, the youth, the first generation that has grown up with no memory of fear, no memory of the knock on the door in the middle of the night, and that's going to change us. They won't be interested in imperialism and so on. Well, it doesn't seem to have happened. There is evidence, it's a couple of years ago, but there was a very good study that Celeste Wallander did with Ted Gerber for CSIS, which showed the most nationalist people in Russia, with the most anti-Western views, were young, university-educated Muscovites. So I don't have great hopes for the middle class. We were told that economic circumstance was going to change everything. Russia simply couldn't afford to run a superpower foreign policy, so in the end Putin would just run out of money and they would have to play nice because of that. And now we're being told that the succession is going to take care of it. Putin is now a lame duck president. From the day he is sworn in as president, everybody will be counting the days until someone else takes over, and therefore he will be weak and we will get change, and therefore everything's going to be all right. And I hope so, but I wouldn't base my policy on it. First of all, there's no evidence, as far as I can see, that this is his last term. He will change something. He will retire to become the head of the Russian Judo Federation. It will turn out the Russian Judo Federation has all the money and makes all the decisions. or something. So there's no, I think that's wishful thinking number one. Wishful thinking number two is to assume that whatever comes after Putin will be better. I'd have thought there's every chance that what comes after Putin will be worse. So on that cheerful note, and the thought that I think that we have sent an extremely dangerous message to Putin that you can get away with attacking other countries, whether it's the cyber attack on Estonia, the kidnapping of Kovo, the war in Ukraine, the war in Georgia, the murder of Litvinenko, and now most recently the attempted murder of Mr. Skripal and his daughter. At every stage we have responded to the Kremlin with a wet, weak response. And at every stage he's gone on to do something bad, and the only real question I think facing us is what will be the next bad thing that he does, and someone will suffer, maybe with their lives, maybe with something else, and the blame will be on the people who had the chance to respond to so many times over the last few years and didn't do it.
Thank you, Edward. I think that Solvita will have more to tell on the younger generation and their political views, but first of all, a word to Anton with his account of the future of the opposition and its fate.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank you for the opportunity to be here. My pleasure. Before jumping into the sort of concerns of the opposition, just wanted to throw a few things out there. Look, the Russian foreign policy and domestic policy, the way it was formulating, did not change because of the elections. The elections, in many senses, did not mean anything because the trends we've been seeing for the last few years, they're going to be maintained, continued both domestically and internationally. With regards to the prospects of the successor, yeah, I don't see that happening anytime soon. I mean, I don't think there's any sort of real reason so far to assume that that's somewhere on the horizon. I mean, I quite agree, Mr. Lucas here, on the prospects of reformulation of constitution or creation of a sort of mechanism like they have in China, for instance, or, you know, there are even funnier ideas, sort of make Russia into a parliamentary republic, for Vladimir Putin to be the leader of one of the parties and be the prime minister as sort of the Russian Merkel of the politics. So I mean, there are no real reasons so far to assume that the successor will be taking place. That's why I'm quite convinced that we won't see a lot of changes in the government. Quite confident that Medvedev is going to stay as the prime minister, because by far he's the most loyal guy you can imagine, and he's done pretty much everything imaginable that was asked from him at all the points. But anyway, if the change of constitution is the case, we will see that happening, or some prospects of that happening next year, the year after that, because they have to pass all the amendments until 2021 with the current Duma. So, you know, how do you proceed from that if you are the Russian opposition? I mean, that's a tough one. Basically, as we have seen, basically there was one particular political campaign worth mentioning, and it was the campaign of Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader, who was not allowed to actually be on the ballot. And just a few sort of facts I wanted to throw out there about the campaign. They've actually started more than a year ahead of the elections. They were able in building so far the most impressive political infrastructure in the country, offices in 84 regions, about roughly 200,000 volunteers, and a lot of them, of course, are representatives of the so-called Putin generation, so people who live their entire lives with Vladimir Putin as the president or prime minister, but in that case it's pretty much the same story. Another fun fact, collectively, Navalny, his closest allies, most active figures in the regions spent over 2,000 days being detained during the course of the campaign. So, and I think Navalny himself spent about 60 days in jail, or even more than that, in the course of the campaign. There are many reasons, of course, why he was not allowed to be on the ballot. First one being that there was not really an election. It was sort of a political act of reformation that, Vladimir Putin will lead the country for another 6 years. But as many of you have seen, there was another, there was another candidate on the ballot, Ksenia Sobchak, that was supposedly representing more or less the same audience. And taking aside all the sort of speculations or not speculations about her connections to the Kremlin, one way or another, they have, as Alexander Kinev writes in the Republic, they have two different sort of strategies for the Russian opposition, and I think it's quite important to mention here. So the strategy that Sobchak represents and representing in the election and is planning to represent now, building a new political systemic liberal party alongside Dmitry Godkov, is basically the strategy of the tiny minority of really nice, intelligent people who share all the nice and cozy liberal values, and basically hoping to change Russia through the process of education, enlightenment, and just working for decades to come to somehow shift the mentality in the way that it would be more democratic and European. What Navalny is going for is basically attempting to build a new majority of Russians. So his strategy and his rhetoric, his image and the way he speaks, the way he addresses the audience is quite different. He's talking to the potential new majority of the Russians, the ones that care about the problems of corruption, the ones that they care about the problems on the efficiency of the state, the ones who are not hardcore Russian imperialist or hardcore communist or any other hardcore, basically reasonable people who could see a different country under different management. And in this regard, he's much more threatening in the sense because hypothetically he has greater chances of building this new coalition in, no one knows how many years in the future than Sobchak. So basically the point here is that we will definitely see some sort of a political force that would emerge on this liberal front as the ones that are being agreed by the Kremlin, the ones that will be trying to build a coalition and get all the people together. We've already seen Sobchak publicly inviting Navalny to join her cause, and he of course refused. And that's quite actually useful for the Kremlin to have this political party that would, aspire to no more than 2, 3, 4%, even in Duma elections, and pretty much saying that's the liberals, that's the support you get. That's who you guys are. So be calm and don't try to steer other things. And what will be his strategy and the strategy for the ones that do not want to play the games? That's a great question. I really doubt they have an idea yet, because basically you need to stay awake, you need to stay motivated, and have your followers and you have your allies being more or less motivated through the entire course of the next 6 years, which is quite hard. So I would assume they would continue pretty much with the same messaging, having their anti-corruption investigations, pretty much using all elections possible. There'll be governor elections next year. I think about 15, 17 governors will be elected. Then there are going to be the elections of 2021, the Duma elections. Of course, their political force would not be registered, so no one exactly knows how exactly they're going to be, addressing that. But I think the bigger issue here would be to maintain the actual political infrastructure in the regions, because we have seen in the course of this political campaign that dozens of people were detained, were harassed, were attacked in many ways. So I would actually assume that we would see a lot of that political body, a lot of that incredible infrastructure being literally individually migrating out of Russia, because the prospects of another 6 years plus of Vladimir Putin making reasonable people do reasonable things and solving their problems, solving the problems of the country individually by taking their bags and applying to a job in Germany and Lithuania and any other countries. So that's probably going to be one of the major challenges, and that's how Russia is not the USSR in a sense, because they pretty much understand that the open door is the best solution. You don't like it, you take your things and you go out. So, taking that into consideration, we of course should not be eliminating the chances of the black swan. So, you know, something happens, things change, and you need to act fast. So far, he's probably the only politician who has the necessary infrastructure to act on it fast. So, I would assume that eliminating him politically would only be efficient in a very moderate sense. I mean, in order to stop his whole movement, you have to eliminate him physically, which probably is too much of a chore, too much of a burden, and too much of a risk. So that's going to be a long and very complicated challenge, and depending on how economic situation evolves, we'll see whether he can attract greater support, even with the resources he has at the current moment. And of course, the key question here is the oil price. I mean, if tomorrow oil price is 20 or 10 per barrel, I mean, situation changes drastically, but that's probably not happening. And once again, it's quite important to mention here that from the economic point of view, I mean, the Russian economy is managing quite well, given the number of institutional challenges, the structural challenges, the lower oil prices, the sanctions. They were actually able to manage the decline in a more or less efficient way. So of course, I mean, there's no prospect of economic growth. There are a number of issues with Russia's pivot to Asia and China being the partner that could pitch in a few bucks here and there for different projects. It's quite complicated, but still, so far as we're seeing, they are able to maintain the situation in a more or less manageable and predictable way. This could, of course, change, and we're already seeing signs of various initiatives to raise taxes, which is, of course, going to be irritating for the majority of people. We'll probably be seeing something being done about the retirement age being raised. That's probably on the agenda. So of course that would be an additional pressure on the system. And as many of you who follow Russia extensively know, there are a great number of local protests. They have no political side to it. They're very social or very economic, and that's definitely going to be on the agenda for the next 5 to 6 years. But anyway, I mean, summing it up, it's going to be a long ride, and it's going to be quite complicated for anyone in Russia or outside of Russia who's trying to somehow to change the minds of the people given the existing framework. But long story short, it's not going away anywhere, so we'll pretty much have to deal with it one way or another, depending on what sort of instrumentarium we have at hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Anton, for this broad overview. I've seen that Edward disagreed with some of the topics, some of the points raised by Anton, but we will continue the discussion later. First, I'll give the word to Solvita.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today, and it's a pity that we do not have these brilliant speakers from Golos. And thank you, Simas, for letting these seats empty, because it is very visual. I'm going to talk about visuals today and about this hypothetical future. How can we go to this? Please imagine that I'm not sitting in front of you, but just near, and you are not watching this presentation, but you are watching my smartphone. So we are talking about youngsters. Oh. Okay. So do you remember this visual? This visual? No? Who don't? So let's start with events happened a year ago. Thank you, Anton. You mentioned these Navalny protests, and these protests were mainly connected with the paper about Prime Minister, with Dmitry Medvedev. And this became a symbol of protests, this duck, yellow duck, żółtая уточка. And it was definitely hype for youngsters, and I'm going to talk today only about youngsters. So how they were approached by Russian administration. It is... just a second. Okay. Yes. So now you remember. This is a film. This film was watched around 26 million times on YouTube, and it became a real hype, not only for youngsters, but youngsters mainly participated in this protest. So, and even now you can find a lot of selfies in VKontakte, in VK, and in Одноклассники. Okay. So it's still on, but. I think that a year ago, the Kremlin or Russian administration decided to develop a new approach towards cognitive resilience. So they decided to find new approach how to work with youngsters. And when we are talking about this cognitive resilience, of course we are talking about mind control. So this is not media literacy, but it is a media literacy Kremlin style. Now we are observing a lot of articles around the world about Facebook and big data from Facebook, but please just imagine that VKontakte and OK also have this amount of big data, and these big data belong to Kremlin. And they also have data from Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, as far as we have a lot of users from our countries. And of course, YouTube. Here you see Navalny, and Navalny definitely is celebrity. He is hero for those who decided that protest is a kind of hype for them. And I'm not able to measure the effect of these Kremlin activities, but we definitely see that also Navalny uses celebritization. So youngsters are not interested in news. So they do not use news. They are mainly interested in entertainment, in celebrities. They have their own ecosystem of media. So they have their own platforms of distribution. So how to address them? And here you see a wonderful project made by Feldman, a photographer from Russia. And you can see that here, this visual shows us superhero. So when we are talking about this cognitive resilience, we are talking about transmedia storytelling of threat. And when you are talking with youngsters, you are talking about a threat as an ecosystem of heroes and anti-heroes. So the aim was to develop an anti-hero, so to make Navalny not a hero anymore. So, how to approach youngsters. Please meet Gnoiny or Slava KPSS or other names for this authority for Russian language youngsters, not only in Russia, but also from Latvia. And I've heard first about Gnoiny from my Russian language students when I work in Latvia. And I tried to understand a little bit, to go a little bit deeper in his songs, and I want to play one. So he's supporting Putin, and in this song he's saying, "I'm very sorry, some rude words are here, but I think that maybe we can deal with it." So I hope I don't know your law. So. He's like a Putin, so he's singing this song on the position of Putin.
Yeah. Слава КПСС. Ты знаешь, кто я? Владимир Путин. Владимир Путин. Владимир Путин. В русском рэпе Владимир Путин. Владимир Путин. Владимир Путин. Владимир Путин. В русском рэпе Владимир Путин. Владимир Путин. Владимир Путин. Владимир Путин. В русском рэпе Владимир Путин. Что ты можешь рассказать
сказать за рэп. Не смей при мне говорить за рэп. Я ебал твой протест, антихайп на века. Моя мать Глинтвейн, мой отец из Чикаго. Чтоб ты знал, мудак, как меня.
And other words are about Navalny. And I'm really sorry for these rude words, but imagine that if you remember in late 80s, in early 90s, rock was rocking and rock was a form of the protest. Nowadays, we see that rap is a form of the protest. And it became a new philosophy. Of course, in Russia, there are a lot of rappers who are not supporting Putin, and they are so-called Western authorities like Oxymoron. And rappers, singers, or readers, they have a lot of battles. So there is a lot of aggression in this way of communication. And now please meet another celebrity. And this man is celebrity #1 in YouTube. So he is a journalist from so-called old media, but he is dealing now with new media. He has very strong journalistic background. And he made popularity, how he made his popularity, he made a lot of interviews with rappers. So with this subculture, with representatives of this subculture. And the next slide, I recorded last videos. So this is screenshot with last videos. And you can see that just a few days before elections, he made an interview with editor-in-chief of Echo Moskvy, with Venediktov. And in this interview, it is possible to hear so positive words about Putin and so positive words about the system. And please imagine that the new Dutch definitely is a man who is building, who is setting agenda for youngsters. And now, of course, not every youngster supports rap culture and rap ideas. So we still have a lot of supporters for this pop culture. And please meet Putin team. So, and this song, I will put it as a phone. But, a lot of celebrities from Eurovision, very important event for Russians. Полина Гагарина, Dmitry Bilan, and a lot of other celebrities, including sportists, hockey player, and so on and so on. But here is very important that each person, each celebrity has its own ecosystem and distribution channels around the informational space, so they can touch youngsters. And here is another supporters of rap, but we have time only for one video. And Leps, of course, is not for youngsters, but when I'm talking about youngsters, you have this active media consumption and you have passive kind of media consumption when you spend time with your parents or when you spend time with your grandparents and watching, I don't know, Первый канал or в России. So officially he is founder of this Putin team, but of course he's quite busy man, so he is hockeyist #1, sportist #1, so I think that he had a lot of supporters, but okay. And here you can see mapping, so how do they map themselves? So this is Putin team, and I tried to find anyone from Lithuania, and I failed, but I found one from Latvia, so you can see that also in Latvia, we don't know if it is real, but at least it is presented that even in Latvia there are some Putin team guys. So, and they are dealing with face-to-face communication, this Putin team. And in Russian language, during these parties or events, they have a lot of halyava, or some items you can get without paying for it, like hats, shapочки, and so on and so on. So this is another way how to attract. But now we are in school, we are entering school. So please meet a doc, new hero, superhero. This is for toddlers. This is not for youngsters. But it is very difficult for me to translate it. It is собака-подозревака от террора спасака. So this dog is able to save someone from terror, so terror is a threat. And I know that these posters were on this place you can vote during elections. So when you are voting, you're observing this sense of terror. That's why I'm talking about transmedia storytelling of terror. And the peak of this transmedia storytelling of terror for youngsters is Sleepers, or the serial Спящие, extremely popular in Russia and delivered on many platforms. So it also was a transmedia storytelling. And Minayev is very popular, and he is a gender setter. He's making interviews by himself. But what do they do in the second season? The second season was shortened than the first one. The first one contains 8 series, and now we had only 4. But these 4 series were in the beginning of March, and it was definitely the pre-election campaign. And here I would like to point out your research, Marius Lavrinavičius. So you are saying a lot about KGB. And now we are observing that they are trying to make this spirit of KGB as a superhero. So they try to do it, and in a very interesting way. And also we can find some visuals of Navalny and those who work with Navalny. Just a second. I want to show you one short episode. How to move. I need to 27th minute. Maybe you can help me. So how can we? Okay. Okay. So it is transmedia literacy Kremlin style. Okay. Okay. So let's postpone it. But just. Okay, I'll try to do it here without a full screen, but please pay your attention to this guy.
Назовем вещи своими именами. Сейчас идет.
Сейчас, простите,
Now you are like in the cinema sitting. So. Sorry for not having popcorn. Редакция интернет-проекта «Текущий момент». And please, those who know Russian, please translate «Текущий момент». Current times, exactly. And he is saying how to make fake.
Назовем вещи своими именами. Сейчас идет информационная война.
He's very bad guy.
Раздали новости, каждая из которых потенциальная бомба.
He betrayed even his family.
Невероятно досталось новости с прошлой темы. Поменяем?
Ну, давай посмотрим. Так, город Волжск, авария на ТЭЦ, 1 человек погиб, 2 квартала без света. Просто шикарная новость, тебе повезло.
Ну, какое отношение эта новость из маленького городка имеет к политической повестке?
Вот смотри. Объясняю на пальцах.
And he tries to explain that it is possible to point out that Putin is guilty. So in few steps. And so it is how Kremlin supporters saw that. And now, sorry. Okay. So I think that this film is. Very interesting indeed, and now we are moving to the end. So do you remember how Putin addressed National Assembly? Very interesting visuals from Maria Snegovaya. And do you remember that he was coughing a lot? And during this, when you see this pause in his coughing, it was about defense. So when he started to talk about defense and threat, he was in a very good shape. He was not coughing anymore. Why I am decided to remind you about this address to National Assembly. Immediately after, he joined another event, KVN. He goes to KVN, and he went to KVN, and he spent hours sitting in Дворец Советской армии. Dvorets Sovietskai Army, so this name still is used, Sovietskai Army, not Russian Army. And why I think that it also is important to point out that he visited KVN. I was one of authors of NATO Stratcom Love report, and my part was dedicated to KVN story. And I remember my own phrase, not phrases from Russian press releases, but my own phrases. So that KVN is a tool ready to use. Now we can see that it is already used. We do not have more improvements because Maslikov and Galustyan and a lot of KVN players during this so-called pre-election campaign became доверенные люди Putina. So I don't know how to translate it correctly. Trusted people, trusted representatives of Putin. And this screenshot is from his speech after so-called election, the results of so-called elections were known, and you can see that Maslikov, the leader of KVN movement, is standing in his office. So during these night events. So thank you very much, and I look forward for the discussion.
Solvita, thank you very much for this interactive presentation. It was very interesting. Actually, I think that maybe we should also start with the discussion, the broader discussion, because we also have some distinguished guests in the audience. So I would like, because maybe you need to run soon, so Arnoldas just went, so I thought that maybe Andrius Kubilius, former Lithuanian Prime Minister, would like to say some words about his own take on the outcome of this so-called election.
Well, Simas, thanks a lot. Really, it's very nice to have such a good discussion. Edward, really, always pleasure. We had interesting discussion with Marius on Monday in Parliament with Russian political refugees here in Vilnius. I am a little bit confused, I would say, by Solvita presentation, because it looks like that really Putin made a very good, professional, Western type campaign, and he won elections. Which is, I am confused because I think that there are no elections in Russia, and there will be no elections in the future. So why he's doing such a campaign, okay, we can guess legitimacy and so on and so on. But I think that we are in some way, at least my vision is that we need to have a broader view. What is going, how things will go, what we should expect, and not try to look very intensively into what is happening really in Russia for the time being. I have, well, maybe I'm wrong. I'm looking to Edward's, evaluation. I think for the time being, I do not see really very good opportunity that internal developments in Russia during the next 6 years, of Putin being president, or even, looking into longer term future, that those internal developments really will change the situation in Russia itself. Of course, anything can happen, whatever, We can expect oil prices going down or what, who knows, But I think that if we shall concentrate ourselves very much on how so-called elections are going on, what type of campaigns Putin is able to do, we shall we shall lose, strategic vision. And from my point of view, really, what Putin did in Great Britain with Novichok and so on, with everything else, it should open much more of our eyes and our understanding, So what we are facing, what the Western community is facing, in the case of Russia. And I would concentrate much more about what Edward was saying, So what should be our reaction to reality of Russia, which is not democratic, which is not become democratic, and we can talk a lot about, election campaigns, but that will be misleading a little bit. I saw, I don't know that name, maybe somebody else knows, but very precise conclusion was made on the day of election by Irina Pavlova, historian, lady, some kind of writer, and she said that what Western community should do should come down to very simple conclusion on what is Russia today. And if we shall stay on discussion, is that, what Putin is using, terminology, is that sovereign democracy or regulated democracy, we shall be, again, in some way going to nowhere. Her conclusion was very simple. What now Russia is modernized Stalinism. So let's forget about, elections, so-called elections, campaigns, and so on and so on. Let's look much more into what we can do with such a situation. And I think that at least my wish would be to concentrate ourselves much more on Western strategy towards Russia. And I think that there is, even Lithuania should look, we can, in some way, of course, we should not expect that we can change Russia, but maybe we can influence some kind of Western strategy. And here I see that Europe, my wish would be very simple. I saw what, at least everybody, we have seen what the United States administration did recently. They put Russia on the level of global security threat. Where EU has Russia, I don't know. For time being, I think that still is somewhere on a much lower level. So let's look for that, question, and then let's move a little bit outside from that box where we are keeping our policy towards Russia, since Maidan Revolution. What in Lithuania we are looking for? We always are looking, prolongation of sanctions, and also, more of military presence of NATO here. That's very good. That's very important. But what I would like to see, that we should look for new possibilities, institutional possibilities. How, in addition to military defense, we should have what I call, united anti-hybrid defense. Well, we are totally weak. I published some kind of my thoughts, some report. I think that we are naked, totally, and especially when we are coming next year to elections, I can imagine what we shall face. That is one thing. And of course, what we can try to do in addition to that, to be much more effective in trying to convince Europe to be less dependent on Russian gas. That's again very important. And the last point, what I will say, in my imagination, one very important thing what Western community can do, and especially with our initiative, it's to try to convince Western community to build, a belt of successful countries around Russia, starting from Ukraine. That would be some kind of strategy which can be a long-term strategy of the Western community towards Russia. Because Russia will stay as we see now. I admire what Navalny is doing, but I doubt if Navalny will be able to win any kind of so-called elections in Russia in the near future. So.
Okay, so Ed, would you like to answer?
Yes, unsurprisingly, I agree with every word Andrej said. I don't want to take away the incredible courage of the people who campaign for Navalny or for Golos and the other people in the third sector. We should all salute them. They are the heirs of the dissidents of the Soviet era. But we can't, but we don't do them any favors by, I think, by wishful thinking. And I fear that to some extent, Navalny, whether or not he likes it, is a kind of safety valve. If you are an organized crime gang, you want a few policemen wandering around so people don't realize that you're actually controlling that part of the city with organized crime, and that there's, in a sense, Navalny's effort is there to lend the fact that he can function to some extent is a way of lending legitimacy to a system that's fundamentally illegitimate. But there are two words we haven't really heard yet, and I just want to throw them in for the discussion. One is criminality, and the other is ideology. And I think that the gangsterization of Russia is a really important element, starting in the 1990s, going on right through to St. Petersburg when Putin was based there, and then through to the Kremlin. And we need to think about how you deal with something that in many ways runs like an organized crime network. But it's not just organized crime, because there's also this ideological dimension. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was an ideological vacuum, and it was filled with all sorts of different elements. But now, to some extent, these have synthesized. And if you haven't read it already, I really urge you to read Mr. Professor Elyakov's book called Inside the Mind of Vladimir Putin. It's a really interesting look at everything from Ilyin and these sort of old white philosophers of the kind of ultra-nationalist whites through to more modern people like the Eurasianists and Dugin. But there's something going on there. I don't understand it myself, but I think it's still a work in progress. But there is this kind of anti-Western ideology full of contradictions and strange things that we don't understand. But it seems to me it's becoming increasingly important, and we need to understand it better.
Yeah, I just wanted to stress the attention to, I think, what is by far one of the most important things the West could do now is to create a unified effort to fight corrupt Russian money. Because from UK to Latvia, it happens all over the place. We know where, we know how, we know why, and this is kind of this very special and tricky political question, because while we talk all the time about countering Russian propaganda, disinformation, and all that, we sort of sometimes want to avoid this question of Russian money that actually helping London and many other places. Let's be honest. I mean, it's a complicated matter, and not everyone wants to address that, but this is something that would actually hurt tremendously, and it has to be a unified effort. Because if UK says tomorrow we're done with that money, I mean they would go somewhere else. I mean look at the Russian properties in Spain, even in Catalonia and many other places. Hundreds of corrupt bureaucrats going there, buying property, and eventually buying residence permits and citizenships for themselves, for their families, and there are thousands of Russians with corrupt money who are all over the place, and it's not that hard. I mean, to locate them, to locate the funds, ask the proper questions. If the answers are not satisfying, then funds are frozen. Thank you.
I'll just make a small interlude. On that table, for those who are leaving earlier, there are Golos reports, which we encourage you to take and read. Solvita, so after this very interesting presentation, a natural question is, what's next? I mean, what do you do with this information that you've presented us? And you know that there were reactions that we need to think about what the West, what the Baltic countries can do to counter, this Russian aggression. So from your experience in media literacy initiatives, what's the best way to maybe try to influence those young minds in the right direction?
I think that we should treat cognitive resilience or informational resilience as a part of defense system, and to invest more in cognitive resilience. And the last opportunity to get in touch with youth is school. So, and to invest more in education and competences. But I think that we also have to think about the hypothetical future. And this hypothetical future is already done by Kremlin. So they worked hard on developing of this hypothetical future and to bringing it here. Also through entertainment, through Vanga stories shown on Lithuanian TV, through Messer and so on and so on and so on. And even in his main phrase during this, not during, but during the concert after elections, the wording used by Putin was "Мы обречены на успех." And those who are dealing with cognitive linguistics, so you have to understand that this word "обречены" is showing the future. So you can do everything in your Western society, but there are also some foreseen I don't know, activities or events, and it is not possible to change this future, this great future of great Russia.
I would encourage the audience to make their own interventions. Introduce yourselves.
Hello, Edvidas Bairunas, Ambassador's Life for Hybrid Threat, Foreign Minister of Lithuania. I would probably jump into the very unfortunate sort of debate against the former Prime Minister Kubilius, defending Solvita, whom I didn't know personally, but I have read her articles, and I think here I would a bit contradict. Why? Because I think there is no dilemma what we should do: either take care of Russia and think about high Western policies, or take care of ourselves. I think both are equally important, because what former Prime Minister Kubilius sort of concluded his remark that next year is election, so we definitely should think about Russia, should think about the future, you know, try to strategize, but still we need to think about ourselves, how we should be more resilient. And here, of course, the question for Edward, you are also taking more care about this sort of your messaging about Russia and what we should do with Russia. But what should do we internally? What our priorities? For example, I follow my Swedish colleagues for this September election, super election in Sweden. They are training 3,000 officials on anti-fake news, and they're investing a lot for the election. So this is one type of resilience. You should invest in your Stratcom activities and so on. There are so many other things to do, but what would be your, but possibly also other speakers in the panel, what we should do internally in developing our own resilience? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question, and I think that defence consists of deterrence and resilience, and you can't do it all with deterrence, you can't do it all with resilience. But the way to look at it is you start off by working on resilience, and that will mean most of the adversary's weapons don't work. So if your financial system is immune to dirty money, if your counterintelligence service is working properly in catching Russian spies, if your criminal justice system is dealing with the Russian gangsters, if your energy system is not open to Russian energy blackmail, if your information system is working properly so Russian propaganda doesn't work, well, there are still things they can do. They can go and kill people, they can invade you, but you're narrowing it down quite a lot. And at the moment we haven't done this basic, boring spade work of resilience. And resilience isn't easy. The reason we have these vulnerabilities is because someone is making money because of the vulnerability, or because someone is saving money by allowing the vulnerability to happen. So we need to put money and time and effort into our resilience, just as you quite rightly say the Swedes are doing. And then we need part two, which is for the things that the resilience won't help with. We cannot run Britain in a way that prevents a highly trained KGB, now FSB or SVR assassin or GRU assassin coming and using a chemical weapon in a peaceful English town. We are never going to militarize or securitize our society to make that impossible. But we can do deterrence. So we need deterrence that works. At the moment we have nuclear weapons. It's great, I love nuclear weapons. But we can't use our nuclear weapons to punish the Russians for trying to kill Mr. Skripal. We need other things. And so I'm a very strong advocate of these financial snap exercises where we should be practicing what can we do in 12 hours, 24 hours, 72 hours. How many Russian assets can we freeze and seize, even at a weekend, even if they're in Cyprus, even if they're in Austria. And we practice that. And by practicing it, we get good at it. And we then say, we keep the exact means how we do it, we should keep quite secret, because we don't want the Russians to develop countermeasures. But we should announce that we had a financial snap exercise this weekend. The scenario was some provocation in eastern Latvia or Suwałki Gap or something like that. And in the course of the exercise, we've identified and froze $54 billion of Russian-related assets. That would send a very clear message to the Kremlin. If you muck around, they can do stuff, we can do stuff that really hurts you. So deterrence and resilience, two sides of the same coin. We need them both. We can perfectly well do it. This is not a question of means, like, we don't have the ability. We have really capable structures. We have all the money we need. The only problem is coordination and willpower. And the solution to that lies with us.
I absolutely agree.
Anton, I would like to ask you, it seems that Putin does not have any convincing ideas or future vision for Russia's economic development. He is not capable of rooting out corruption, for instance, because it's the backbone of his regime. So it seems that what he's left with is these, international aggression against the West, primarily against the West in many arenas, like, for instance, Syria, Ukraine, and the West itself. So how do you envisage the immediate future in terms of Russia's foreign policy? I mean, is it enough for Putin to have these theaters of action that are already in place, or is he moving somewhere else, and what can we expect in this action?
Thanks for the question. Well, quite honestly, I doubt that there's the strategy laying somewhere there in the Kremlin with the 5-point action plan of what to do next. So far, is what we could say is not much is going to change from what we've already seen in the past few years. So, I mean, Russia is not going anywhere out of Syria. It's impossible. But still, I mean, Russia actually left Syria twice, but, nevertheless, it's becoming, it's more and more engaged in what's happening there. We don't see much progress when it comes to Ukraine. Also, I don't quite see it happening anytime soon. So what quite ridiculously is still happening in Moscow is that there's a still sort of existing conviction that there's something that could be done with Donald Trump, President of the United States. Despite all the facts that the Trump administration is not going to propose a huge Yalta II or any other way or form of a huge compromise, new rules of the game, how the world should be run, there's still this desire in Moscow to reach out and discuss. I mean, even his general message to the Federal Assembly, 40 minutes, talking about Russian rockets and all the Wunderwaffe and all the neat little things Russia will have or has or will possess in the future. It's sort of an invitation to this big discussion that he's still hoping to get. To be honest, looking at the United States, are not seeing that happening, period. Same as Russia is not actually having anything that they could actually give back as a compromise. Because one thing is, the culture of compromise with this Russian administration is not really kind of working well. Any compromise is a failure. And I don't actually see what could be traded for what, because the positions are so far off between the West and Russia, so I'm not seeing any major development that it could change. Also, I'm not really buying this argument that is actually being circled around a lot in Russia that, Kudrin or some other guy will help out with economic reforms. That's why there's some sort of pacification or normalization of relations with the West is needed. Not really seeing that happening anytime So moreover, I think what's more important now is basically we are constantly asking ourselves, is Russia ready to talk or compromise? But I'm not quite sure the West has said pretty much everything it has to say about what Russia already did. So in this regard, Moscow still has to wait out for the entirety of reaction of UK, US, and other nations to see where we are at that moment. So not really seeing a chance for any sort of normalization of even these bad relationships. So we're still going to be seeing a lot of kind of rocky actions from all sides and few surprises. And moreover, I mean, you have the strategy, tactics of, sudden surprises. I mean, today you're in Ukraine, tomorrow you're in Syria, the next day you're somewhere in cyber attacking or doing something else. And, why give that up? I mean, that's been working quite smoothly for the Kremlin so far. So, yeah.
Are there any more questions? Vaidotas?
Thank you. My name is Vaidotas Beniušis. I'm a journalist at Baltic News Service Newswire. Speaking about the response, just a few ideas. Today I spent some 2 hours greeting high school students, 16, 17 years old at BNS office, and we started this media literacy stuff on our own. A few months ago, we greeted around 100 students. Now, just to talk about media, to show examples about fake news that we face, telling the examples like we saw provocations against German troops, but also learning from them. It's really, great for me to know, they are on Snapchat, not on Facebook, and so on, where to address things. What Solvita showed was really also adding to that knowledge. I think that's part of what every of us in our profession could do, just talk to students, which I see some negative trends in Lithuania also, just especially after Crimea. I saw the military guys taking a very huge role in our public sphere. Military people are, their conclusions is the basis for banning Russian channels, which I think is bad for democracy. I think it can create illusion that military gets into sphere where they should not. Also, we can hear some military guys, giving interviews where they say that every talk about Lithuanian Holocaust past is Russian propaganda. Part of it is, part of it is not. So I see that danger in that. Just you give pretexts for the other side to claim they are all the same, which is not the truth, but you just give these arguments. We also, hearing debates about the need to ban the speech that is foolish towards Russia, and we hear sometimes too little debate on that. I think that's also our responsibility as media people, and my own. I don't say that we do everything perfect. For me, every day, is the search between this balance. Yes, not to be naive, to show where propaganda is, to show it's propaganda, but also not to try to engage. I can just send one example also what happened, I think, in 2014, just immediately after Crimea. One very well-known also editor, media guy, one of the top guys, we met to discuss with some editors how to, he started discussions that, okay, we should change the vocabulary that we do, that we should not say Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine, they should say Russian army and the collaborators, which, I refused. I think there were not facts for that, but I see sometimes trends that we use the Russian methods. And I think that is also a danger, and that we need every day to look for balance. If you have any advice for media people, the criteria how to look for balance, that also would be very useful. Thank you.
I think it was
Russian, it was a remark. Thank you for your remark.
Well, but it's a very great remark, and I want to come back on it, because I think there's two ways that we can lose this. There's the obvious way, which is that we end up like Italy, where you have basically the entire effective political class is captured, the public becomes utterly apathetic, thinks none of this matters, and you just have the kind of baked in sort of a kind of insecurity culture where you don't care about your own security, you don't care about your allies' security, and everyone just retreats into the private sphere and tries to survive and make money and so on. And that's the kind of obvious way of losing. But there's another way you can lose, which is if you Putinize your own society in response to Putinism. And I'm much more worried about that in the kind of strong countries of Europe, because it's very tempting to say, we need to do something. We need to seize their money. Well, that's fine, but don't forget we do have property rights and the rule of law. We need to deal with Russian propaganda, but actually the dividing line between bad journalism and outright propaganda is very blurry, and a lot of people will disagree about things. I think something is just brilliant satire, someone else thinks it's a terrible hoax, someone thinks this is very tendentious, shamefully partial reporting. I think it's a punchy story, very well told, and you leave out the inessential bits. And I don't want courts making those decisions. I don't want politicians making decisions about content. It's a hallmark of a free society is that you are able to make mistakes. It's a sign of good journalism that you're getting everything, getting things wrong. When I read the North Korean news agency, I don't really see many corrections. And so we've got to live with that. We've got to live with imperfections in our society, and the fact that things go wrong and we then try and put them right afterwards is the sign that we're living in a free society. So I think that's very important. I want to defend the right of bad journalists to do bad journalism, even if I get very annoyed about it. I think we can push back on the anonymity of platforms, though. So I think that's a different thing. There's a brilliant example here in Lithuania. If you go to BNS, or to Delphi or one of these things, this is real news, because not so much because of the content, that's pretty good, but because you are a real organization. You have a street address, you have a phone number, you have a bank account. People can see that this is Mr. Benusis, he works for it, and he's there on Facebook, and all sorts of other things. So you have a quality of realness which doesn't exist when it comes to one of your disinformation rivals like Bolt News. Baltnews.lt, last time I looked, has no way of contacting I don't know if any journalists from Balt News are here. That'd be great, wouldn't it? But there's no way. It's owned by some weird company that says it's in Sweden, called something like Baltic Novosti or something. We've no idea who the people are. We've no idea where they get the information from. It's fake, and the same with Baltnews.lv and Baltnews.ee. We saw this really clearly in the American election, when the hacking and leaking attack only worked because they were able to put it on DC Leaks and USA Politics Today, which were fundamentally fake sites. Didn't have street addresses, didn't have phone numbers, and concealed all their identity. They used these troll and bot networks, which are fake. I don't care so much about the content being fake, but the fact is they are not real people. You go on the Twitter and they aren't eggs. You go on to Facebook and they have pictures that they've taken from other sites to make themselves look like real people. And that, I think, is a good angle of attack. I think we can say that we can push Twitter and Facebook and Google to give us better information about realness. I proved this. I gave evidence to the British Parliament and to their fake news inquiry. And the MP chairing the inquiry is called Damien Collins. So in 10 minutes on the internet, I set up a Gmail account for damien.collins.mp@gmail.com. I set up a Twitter account in his name. I set up a Facebook page in his name. And I bought damien.collins.mp.org. And I set up a website in his name. And I also set up a website for the inquiry, the fake news inquiry, called DCMS, Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee, Fake News Inquiry.org. It cost me about £40. It was the best £40 I ever spent. I then took screenshots of all of this, deleted it all from the internet, of course, and then I produced the committee. I said, this is how easy it was for me to impersonate you. Now, you're lawmakers, you can go to Facebook and say, we don't want that. I'm not saying it should be forbidden to do it. I don't say it should be against the law. But at least Facebook and Twitter and Google should give some clues about who the real people are, so we don't confuse the real people with the fake people. Sorry, that was a long answer, but it's much on my mind at the moment.
Hello, I'm Anna Dovbach from Eurasian Harm Reduction Association, working here in Vilnius. And my more comment, but also question that we are having. We have activists in Russia, and what they are now trying to do, it's just document, and they are saying we can't change anything, we're just documenting the crime, and that's the only we could do, and actually we are helping to do this and all of this, you know. But the tricky point here, and in Ukraine, because I'm from Ukraine, that we are facing not just a Russian enemy, not just the Russians, but civilization choice. If we in our countries have relearned helplessness, like we were trying in Maidan to change something and nothing, fascists come into LGBT events. We were trying to change oligarchs, but we didn't succeed. We are trying to go to protest, but we are having nothing. Then we are trying to get support to civil society or initiative groups, but we can't succeed to have it. Then people learn this helplessness and learn how democracy doesn't work. And this, for me, is the most challengeable stuff, because they become supporters of the strong power, and automatically they become supporters of populists and Putin. I don't know who is paying whom among populists in Europe, but that's somehow the same ideology, and it's easier to influence. And that's why development of the small civil society, for youth as well. So they are actually, in comparison with these pictures, they are more learning to fear, because all schools were tackling these ducks guys much harder, and they learned again the same as in 1937. So for me, support of civil society and small initiatives and all of these protests, and not labeling them that you are the hand of crime. What is now happening? Any protest, any disargument with the ruling parties, at least in Ukraine, always will be marked. It is any left movements always marked as you are not nationalist, you are not patriotic, and you are the hand of crime.
It's not really for outsiders to say this, but you haven't lost yet. No, you really haven't. I mean, this is just incredible. You have elections in Ukraine and we don't know who's going to win. This is really important. You have the biggest free press in the former Soviet Union. Because I don't count. Yeah, you really have. I mean, don't talk yourself into feeling you've lost. You're an absolute. You know, I mean, I talked to the Belarusian opposition, and they would love to have your problems. I mean, I know that's no comfort. It's easy for an outsider to say, but I mean, I think we should be. I mean, what Ukraine faced in 2014 was the most astonishing combination of a financial economic crisis, a political constitutional crisis, and a huge geopolitical security crisis. And any one of those would have been enough to tip even a strong country over. And you had the worst government I think anyone in Europe has had for decades. You know, the worst people imaginable, run by incompetent bandits. And you still came through all these three crises, and you're still fighting. So let's be patient.
So we have time for 2 more questions or comments. Is there anyone willing to intervene?
Dalia Bankauskaitė, Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis. It's a question. When is this turning point, critical mass turning point, to have this political will to have financial snaps, quick quick, really reaction. Rather, otherwise, every debate, every expression of opinion sounds like a bad consultancy. We use all this should, would, it's better to do this, or we should do that. When? And how? What should happen that in the West we should act united? At least on some very particular, what should we, being so organized, civically organized and really impatient, how we should organize to trigger this political will to act. We had Novichok, it's not enough. What else?
More yes. Is that for me? Yeah.
It's just, an open question for everyone.
You guys go first, then I shall add anything you haven't said. Increase the dose of Novichok.
It is not connected with Novichok, but it is connected with what you said about media. And we also have Ofcom, and a lot of channels supporting Kremlin content are registered in the UK. So this is just to put in before your answer.
Okay, I don't quite know. I mean, what you guys need in order to sort of wake up and work as a united front. I actually wanted to comment rather on the previous question about how to where is the balance, how to maintain this proper balance. I think it's actually one of the key issues here, because the worst thing you can do while being in the West is mimic what Russia is doing in terms of censoring information or fighting propaganda with propaganda. I mean, you are in a more vulnerable position by definition. You have the freedom of speech, you have all sorts of freedoms, all sorts of, sort of higher ground points that you're defending, and it's by default easier to target you than to target the Russian audience or the Russian propaganda or disinformation inside the country. So, the proper response to this challenge is, more honest journalism, more honest analysis on all sorts of issues in many languages. I mean, looking into, say, AfD in Germany, I mean, is the answer banning websites that support AfD and somehow are meeting and talking to people in Russia? Well, maybe working with some of that technicalities in terms of how much real they are, as Mr. Ukoza said. But most of the answers usually come with solving the issues at hand that actually make it possible for folks from Russia to come in, meet them, and sort of create this far right or far left united. But long story short, I mean, it's a very tricky and a dangerous situation where the natural reaction is basically to attack the attacker, and in this crossfire we all the time see that people of critical views towards the own governments in respective countries of Europe, especially when it comes to the issues of Ukraine, as were mentioned. We have this natural desire to attack anyone who does not support what we view as a proper cause, and not always they are paid by the Kremlin. They have legitimate concerns over how the countries are developing, and once again, quite easy to start looking for, launching this witch hunt, which from time to time happens. And unfortunately, all of that plays into Kremlin's arguments that they're pretty much doing what we're doing, is just, they are more hypocritical about it. So this balance should always be maintained between, having this bad journalism, having views that are critical of the governments, even if they are not something you like, and taking an extra effort to support the proper journalism, proper understanding, education, and investigation of Russia's activities, of what Russia is, because frankly I don't think we know that in a decent and wholesome manner. And thinking about your own societies and probably spending more money on issues or on information in various languages taking away, especially for the Baltic states, taking away this leverage that the Kremlin has on the command of the language. There has to be more Russian language media of all forms and colors. Thank you.
Daniel, I just so agree. I think Keir Giles put this very well. He said we've got to stop admiring the problem, start working out how to solve it. I think Keir Giles put this very well, and I agree so much. He said we have to stop admiring the problem and start trying to solve it. I think we've got to. I think the West is a bit of an illusion, and the historical perspective is a bit deceptive. That actually the West has always been very divided. I grew up during the Cold War in the 60s and 70s. I remember the 70s very well. I think because of the way the Cold War ended, we have this feeling that there's kind of magic combination. You've just got to crash the oil price, raise the arms spending, have someone like, we have Reagan and Thatcher in the two most important capitals, add Helmut Kohl for good measure, and the wall comes tumbling down, the captive nations are free, and we can all live happily ever after. And that, I mean, that was a wonderful time. I spent those years, not least here, but they came after 4 decades where we thought we might lose at almost every stage. So we mustn't allow our benchmark should be rather modest rather than rather ambitious for how things change. I apologize for chewing gum. I have to do this because otherwise I lose my voice. It's a revolting habit. I'm sorry. I think we need coalitions of the willing, the speedy, and the capable. And if you're not willing, speedy, and capable, then you're not much use. So we've got to say goodbye to relying on, I love Portugal and Belgium and all these other kind of Iceland, these NATO countries that are, but if you can't actually help on the stuff we need to do, then you're not, we can't run things at 29 or 27 anymore. But even with the countries we've got, we can still win. And as I'm not sure I said it here, but the Nordic, Baltic, Polish 9, just those 9 countries, 3 Baltics, 5 Nordics and Poland, your GDP is bigger than Russia. You spend 40 billion on defense, Russia spends 80 billion. Maybe the Russian 80 billion is a fake number, maybe it's more. But they have to run a strategic nuclear weapons program, military satellites, and worry about China. These 9 countries just need to worry about Russia. So it's not a problem of means. We need to keep the high ground and fortify the high ground. We need to be not just better, but dramatically better than Russia. As far as the people inside Russia are concerned, it's tricky. We can't give them false hope. Sometimes there's what the Russians call the bear's service, the kiss of death, helping them maybe the last thing that you want. But we could do more. We can name streets after Nemtsov. This is a very good thing. Don't let the Kremlin ever think that we've forgotten about this, or we've forgiven it, or that we've think there's nothing we can do. We should be, the main thing is Putin should wake up every morning thinking, oh shit, what are they going to do to me next? Rather than what happens at the moment is that we wake up. And I'll finish up on this because you made an excellent point about Russia watching capability. I think we are getting less bad at working out what they just did to us. But this is like driving a car where you're always looking in the rearview mirror saying, what was that thing I just drove over? We should be looking through the windscreen at what's coming towards us, because this is accelerating. Russia they're not stupid. Their tactics are evolving all the time. There was stuff they were doing 5 or 10 years ago. They don't do it anymore because they know that we can see it and we can deal with it. And I'm really scared when I talk to governments and intelligence services and how little capability we have for looking at the next generation threats. I think you're probably better at it here, particularly in the 3 Baltic states. I think you have an ability to see and smell and hear the next generation threat before we do. And so my final recommendation for the people outside watching is that we've really got to use the incredible expertise and kind of sensitivities that the frontline states, or that you guys have. I don't think frontline states is right. Salisbury is a frontline town now. Is that credible? Britain is a frontline state. They don't dare do this sort of attack here. They do it in Britain. Now, on that Chevrolet, I'll stop.
Oh yeah. Sorry, again, I will try to be very short with my question. My name is Andrius Kubilius. I'm local here, so sorry. But you know, I'm coming back to this all the stuff of hybrid. So in my view, yeah, we are, you know, we need to strengthen our military, you know, deterrence capabilities and so on. But we know more or less what we need to do, you know, to spend more money and so on and so on. When we're talking about hybrid, it's very broad. And we're taking separate issues, you know, not looking into the whole picture. We know what to do with cyber, you know, we know what to do, at least, you know, theoretically, with fake news. Yes, we know that, you know, dirty money are coming into political system, but we are, you know, looking, you know, each issue in a separate way. When, as I understand, Putin, several years ago, he created a joint united military center for hybrid offense, where he has everything in the same room, and where he combines all those, you know, instruments. So I remember that in one article I read that in Great Britain, Theresa May was considering that maybe they will create also in the government some kind of war cabinet on anti-hybrid. I don't know if that was done. So my question is if that was done. And that is exactly what I think it's a good example of what is needed to be done in all our countries, including maybe to have a much stronger joint, you know, centers on NATO level. I don't know if EU is able to do it. Because what we are facing really, we're facing, again, I'm repeating, separate issues. We are not able to combine. And all our institutions which are working in that field, usually they're making good analysis after. We are losing, you know, hybrid battle.
The answer is yes. We decided about a year ago to certainly have the JSAT, which is the Terrorism Assessment Centre. Yeah, we set up something called JTAC when terrorism became a big problem, and Joint Terrorism Assessment Centre. We now have something called JSTAT, which is for hostile states. And it's a great idea, and I'm very glad we've made Russia into a Tier 1 national security threat. We have a strategy. I've even got some notes somewhere about what's going on. But it is still, it's assessing what's happening, working out whether it matters, and trying to decide if we're doing the right thing about it. The problem we've had so far, and this is not just my government, I think it's the Germans, the Americans, and everyone, is that when you try and do a whole-of-government response to a threat, the first thing you get is a massive turf war between all the different, and what I see at the moment is our Foreign Office, our uniform military, our MOD, our security intelligence services, the criminal justice system, all fighting each other about who should be doing what on this. It's not a very, luckily most of it happens in private, if not in secret. But we haven't worked out how do we do whole-of-government response. I'm not sure any country is really getting it right at the moment, but that's what we've got to do. Not just whole-of-government, but actually whole-of-society, because you've got to cross that. It's not just public sector and classified and official. You've got to get the private sector in, because a lot of this stuff happens, the battleground is in business and finance, and it's not just about whether things are illegal or not, it's about whether they're right or not, and getting the business decision makers to say, I won't do that, not because it's illegal, not because it's not profitable, I won't do that because it's not good for my country. That's a big shift. And then you've got to bring in the whole third sector, universities, NGOs, all that sort of stuff. So this is a task as big as we faced in the 1940s at the start of the Cold War. And I wish we were further along with it, but you're absolutely right in identifying it.
Okay, I think our time is up. It seems that we need to be more resolute and strategic on all levels, both in the military, security and hybrid areas, but also in engaging with Russian civil society effectively and strengthening those parts of it which are really capable of mounting an opposition to the Kremlin regime. And I'm referring back to one of Ed's first remarks. Don't be surprised if the center of power moves to Judo Federation in the next 6 years. Yeah. Anyway, so just once again, I repeat that we hope that our Golos colleagues will be healthy, secure, and fine very, very soon. We support their activities and efforts. And be sure to take the Golos report when you leave the place. And we very much hope to see you in our next events and conferences, panels, and so on. Thank you very much.